Well, aloha everyone, and welcome back to People and Nature here at Chaminade University. Today we will be investigating Unit 8, or Animal Husbandry, giving a little bit of history of the animal science industry. Now, humans have been domesticating animals for over 10,000 years. The very first domesticated animal was the dog, but that was followed shortly thereafter by cattle, sheep, and goats, or ruminant animals. These animals were domesticated as food animals, and humans shortly thereafter domesticated pigs as well. The benefit to pigs is that they were not only food animals, but they were used used as disposal of food scraps and table waste. And in this way, you could take your excess food and basically store it in the form of an animal that later you could eat for food if you ended up short on meals. They also domesticated horses and cattle. Now, humans domesticated horses and cattle primarily for transportation and draft work purposes, so not for food animals. And originally, the first sets of animals that were domesticated were animals that formed large herds or flocks, and that ate a lot of different types of foods, right? A variety of food source would be beneficial to the humans because then they could keep these animals alive no matter what kind of feed they had available. That would lead to easier domestication. Now, when I say the word domestication, I don't mean just taming an animal. So there are several different marks of domestication. So animals are considered to be domesticated when they are kept for a distinct purpose, and their breeding is entirely controlled by humans, or almost entirely controlled by humans. Their survival depends on humans. That means that humans feed them and take care of them and nurture them, etc. And they start to develop traits that are not found in the wild, or alternatively, they start to lose traits that were found while they were in the wilds. Now, domestication is a benefit both to the animal and to the humans. Domestication allows the humans to contain the animals that have the right temperament. So you can pick and choose the animals that you like, and then you can mate the ones that are nicer and nicer, and eventually get tame animals. This allows you to have a steady food supply, and you can have animals available for other purposes as well, such as companionship, religious purposes, and draft work as well. In return for the human, in return the animals receive protection from the humans, and also a constant food supply. So it's a benefit to both parties. And over time, this led to selective breeding, right? So humans get to choose which animals they want to breed, and the ones that have undesirable traits, they choose not to breed, and the ones that have desirable traits, they choose to breed. And so that means that they can breed for or against specific traits that they find desirable. Now, here's a list of different animals that are domesticated animals. If we were in class, I would have you sit down and put down what order you think they were domesticated in, but I'll just go ahead and let you know. These animals start with sheep. So, approximately 11,000 to 15,000 years ago, sheep were domesticated mainly because of their wool and also for their meat. So, they're still used and bred today for wool and meat. And what's interesting about sheep, sheep are one of the only species of livestock that are unable to return to the wild because they've been selectively bred for so many generations that they would simply not survive in a wild environment. Cattle were domesticated approximately 10,000 years ago. They're domesticated mainly in the boundary of Europe and Asia and Southwest Asia. And cattle were mainly used for meat and milk and labor. But eventually, horses replaced them for the draft work, so they weren't used for labor after horses came around, and they were generally just used at that point for meat and for milk. Horses are domesticated approximately 5,000 years ago. This again happened in Eastern Europe and Western Asia, including Mongolia and Siberia. And interestingly enough, horses were originally used for meat and for milk, but eventually they became the most useful draft and pack animals. About 5 to 9,000 years ago, pigs were domesticated. This occurred in Middle East, in the Mesopotamia region. And they were utilized in farming communities most often because A, they're very difficult to move for long distances, and B, they live off table scraps. So farming communities tend to have a lot of food waste that they're able to then feed to the pigs. One of the earliest animals domesticated in Western Asia was the goat. It was domesticated approximately 6 to 7,000 BC. And the goat's actually partially domesticated because it's very easy for a goat to revert back to its wild state, as goats are very unruly and will eat anything. So they have whatever food source is available will keep them alive. Chickens were domesticated 3,400 years ago. That was also, again, in Southeastern Asia, like the area like China, Laos, Vietnam, etc. And turkeys are the only North American domesticated animal that was domesticated in Middle North America. Now, again, if we were in class, I'd have you go back and forth and take notes, so you can do this if you'd like, if you want to go backwards and forward to figure out what the timeline. But if you were to have written the timeline accurately previously, you would see sheep go first, right? And then cattle, and then goats and pigs are approximately the same. And then horses and chickens would have been the correct order for that. So let's talk about animal science. Right? So much goes into the farming and agricultural industry. We have lots of different areas or subspecialties of animal science. So, animal husbandry is the art of working with farm animals, whereas animal science would be more of the scientific study of the farm animals, not necessarily working with them directly, but studying their behaviors and patterns. Biology is a very broad, encompassing study of the science of life, right? So, it's going to study all of the natural world and the environment. But these are some of the subtopics that you might be exposed to if you were to get into a career in animal science. Things like genetics, where we can breed specific traits into or out of animals. Embryology, which looks at the different stages of embryonic development for multiple different animals. Zoology, which looks at all of the different animals as well. It looks at anatomy and physiology. All of that falls under the zoology category. Botany would be looking at plants, which could involve what type of feed you might want to feed animals, etc. We already talked about anatomy and physiology. Chemistry is a really big important one as well, particularly in the food science area. So you want to make sure that nutrition and chemistry go hand in hand, that the animals are getting all of the micronutrients that they need. Pathology would be looking at disorders and diseases. So if you ended up with an animal that was in a disease state, you would use a pathologist to take a look at that. Parasitology would be used if you have an animal that is infested with some sort of parasites. And then there's a ton of other fields that all play a role in animal science, including computer science, right? You want to make sure that you know which animals are where in the herd. In fact, a lot of animals even have GPS tags now. That goes back with communications. And then finance, right? This is not free. The objective of this is to make a profit, and so you want to make sure that you are being as conservative as possible with your money. And then microbiology goes into the parasitology. Engineering is part of making sure that you've got a very smooth running farm as well. So all of these different fields all play a role in the overview of animal science. So let's take a look at animal agriculture here in the United States. The very first set of livestock came to the West Indies in 1493, right? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and in 1493, he actually transported the livestock to the West Indies. Later on, in that same approximate time frame, though, Cortez in 1519 brought sheep and cattle over to Mexico. And then here in what we consider to be the United States, in 1539, De Soto brought horses and pigs to Florida. And then in 1641, one of the major leaps in the meat industry was a meat packing using salt. So exportation of meat became possible because you could cure it with salts. And then a little bit after that, in the mid 1700s, animals started being selectively bred, which created multiple different types or species of, for example, dogs, etc., multiple different breeds of a species. I apologize. Multiple different breeds of dogs, or of cattle, or of any of these different types of livestock. Now, in 1861 and 1865, the United States was struck by a civil war. And while this was going to cause a lot of upset and upheaval in the United States itself, it also led to huge changes in the animal agricultural industry. Number one, first and foremost, we created railroads. And railroads decreased the need for horses and mules. So we no longer had to take people by horse and buggy, right? We no longer had to transport things by carts. We were able to use railroads to transport things from one side of the country to the other. And that also meant that we could raise animals in one location and sell them at another location and consume them at yet another location, because we have the refrigeration of boxcars. So we're no longer limited by how long it takes us to get the food from point A to point B before it spoils. And that led to changes in tastes. Before the war, pork was one of the most popular meats because it was easily stored and you could have salted meat, right? But after refrigeration and refrigerated boxcars, beef became a much more popular meat. So all of a sudden, cows became a more coveted animal for food industry than, for example, the pigs had been. A little bit later on in 1862, or approximately the same time frame, we end up with the Land Grant Act in the United States, which allows public lands to be used for universities to teach agriculture. Right after that, we end up with the Hatch Act, which allows experimental stations. And then in 1914, the Smith-Lever Act, which establishes the Cooperative Extension Services. All of this allowed for large expanses of the animal agricultural industry in the United States. So, what are the purposes of having domesticated animals? Well, first and foremost, food, right? We've talked about that pretty extensively. Beef is eaten in larger quantities than any other meat in the United States. However, if you look at per capita, mutton and chevon are eaten by more people in the world than any other meat, and that's simply because there are regions of the world where eating beef is completely forbidden, and so is pork. For example, Hindus do not eat beef, or Muslim, Hindu, and Orthodox Jews do not eat pork. And so if we are limiting the types of meat that we are eating by large religious groups, then we can change the quantities of those and the amount of people that are consuming that specific meat. Many people in the world also eat horse meats, and we get milk from multiple different sources. So when you think of milk, you think of cow's milk, but we also have goat milk, ewe milk, I apologize, mares, sows, llamas. So we can get milk from a lot of different female animals, yak milk, for example, and reindeer milk. But in addition to food sources, animals also contribute clothing needs like wool, hair, hides and leather, pelts, etc. And in over 100 different countries, we use fibers from ruminants. Remember ruminant animals like cows and goats and sheep, I apologize, not goats, cows and sheep. And they create things like wool, and we've used this in the manufacture of all sorts of things, like everything from clothing to carpets to bedding and other housing materials. Additionally, animals help contribute to shelter. For example, hair and hides could be used in teepees, etc. Plasters often has horsehair in it to help keep it from crumbling, to give it strength and housing materials. And then also bones and hides were used early on for tools and lashing. And utensils, things like bladders were used to be able to transport liquids, etc. And then multiple other personal items that came from animal products, such as combs and jewelry and perfume. So animals actually have multiple sets of contributions to society, including draft animals and labor. Animals have always been important for draft work, for packing things and transporting humans. In fact, in the 1920s, over 25 million horses were used, particularly primarily for draft purposes. Now, in developing countries worldwide, animals are still used as agricultural power, and 20% of the world's populations depend on animals for moving goods. In India, which again, you're not allowed to consume cattle in India, but have over 200 million cattle and buffalo that are used primarily for the purposes of field work, right? So for draft animal purposes and labor. Animals also help contribute to war, again, for transportation and power. And oftentimes they're associated with religious rites because societies worship animals or worship parts of animals or have strength that they get from their spirit animals, etc. Additionally, companionship and recreation. Everyone can think of their favorite pets, and also sports such as horseback riding, etc. And some things you might not think about, right? Laboratory animals are used for research to help keep all of us safe and to test out a lot of our drugs that we then will end up using if they have been deemed safe. Additionally, we use miniature pigs in laboratory research because they closely resemble humans in a lot of different stages of their development, and so they can be used as test subjects. Additionally, we've used cattle and sheep as test subjects for transferring artificial organs before we use different procedures, primarily in humans. And also, we use animal byproducts regularly and as byproducts in pharmaceuticals. And so we actually use animals in a lot of different ways as contributors to our society at large. So thank you guys very much for listening to me today. I really appreciate your time and patience. And I will see you next time. Aloha and happy studying.